Hello, welcome to the fourth lecture in the Leo Baeck Institute's 70th Anniversary Lecture Series. My name is Magda Wrobel, and I'm Associate Director of Public History. For those who were unable to join us for the previous lectures, I'm pleased to remind you that the Leo Baeck Institute is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. As part of the celebrations, LBI has launched a special series of 7 lectures, each exploring one key theme in German Jewish history through the lens of evolving historiography. Historiography, like history itself, changes with each generation of scholars. While older approaches might have focused on big themes, the newer approaches often focus on microhistory, including struggles, failures, and a broader social fabric that shaped Jewish life. Through this lecture series, the LBI seeks to present a wide-ranging view of 7 major topics in German Jewish history, asking how the way we write and understand the history has transformed over time. And so far, we had 3 lectures on early modern, religion, and politics. This is our 4th lecture. We still have 3 more to go. This will be economics, Austria, and gender. And today we are honored to welcome Professor Tobias Brinkmann, who will speak on migration. And I would like to say a few words about our speaker. Tobias Brinkmann is the Malvin and Lea Bank Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Penn State University, University Park, Pennsylvania. His publications include Between Borders, The Great Jewish Migration from Eastern Europe, Oxford University Press 2024, Sundays at Sinai, A Jewish Congregation in Chicago, University of Chicago Press 2012. This book was also finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in 2013. Professor Brinkmann also edited Points of Passage, Jewish Trans Migrants from Eastern Europe in Scandinavia, Germany, and Britain, 1880-1914, New York, Bergen, 2013. And I would also like to remind you that Professor Brinkmann gave another lecture based on his last book earlier this year. The title of the event was Closing Border, Immigration and World War I. And this lecture can be still viewed on the LBI YouTube channel. After the lecture, there will be also time for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please write them in the Q&A box. And now, please, Tobias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks also to your colleagues at the Leo Baeck Institute. So I'm going to share my screen here for the presentation. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. And as Magda said, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and then Magda will moderate the discussion. So I'm going to talk about migration, 70 years of German Jewish historiography. Here is a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I need to talk a little bit about Germany, where that is. Interestingly enough, one of the topics in this series is Austria. So what Germany is, where it's actually located, Central Europe, and beyond that requires a little bit of discussion because migration does involve borders and also projections, exile. And the question is always what Germany are people talking about. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the historiography, how scholars wrote about it, and then I'm actually going to give a brief overview of different Jewish migrations within, through, to, and from Central Europe after 1800. So I'm going to focus on that period after 1800. I need to talk also, that's really important, about influential narratives and images that really dominate the discussion. For instance, this view that Jews are always migrating, that's really powerful. It's actually quite problematic. And that leads also to this really important question. Are Jewish migrations just normal, like other Italians, Irish, or were Jewish migrations unique, as some people argue? And then I'm going to talk again a little bit about scholars and actually talk a little bit about a couple of books. And at the end, a little bit about the period after 1948. So let's get right into this. Locations. Uh, where is Germany? So that is not clear. In around 1800, this is a map from 1812. So this is under at the end of the Napoleonic period, just when Napoleon launched this war against Russia. So this is a pretty confusing map, but in many ways it would change a couple of years later, and then it would change again. And when the German Empire or Imperial Germany was founded, so it's complicated, and the political borders are not necessarily the borders of areas that were culturally influenced by the German language, by German works in books in the German language. So it's complicated. What is much easier to determine is centers of Jewish life, and one important one, of course, is South Germany. So that's this area here, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden. There are many Jewish communities. Actually, in numerical terms, not a big deal, but there were Jews living in small villages, especially in Franconia, in what's now the north of Bavaria, in parts of Baden and Württemberg, and much fewer Jews lived in North Germany, actually, so that's hardly relevant. However, Bohemia is quite important, which belonged to the Austrian Empire, and also Posen, that's here on this map. At this point, it belongs to the Duchy of Warsaw. It had actually belonged to Poland before the partitions that occurred before 1812, and it would become a province of Prussia. Today, it's essentially the western part of Poland. So that's a region that moved around a lot. That's a really important center of Jewish life. And some of the most prominent Jews in Germany after 1800 come from Posen, Leo Beck, for instance. And also Alsace, which ends up being part of France until 1871. That this area had also quite important, really significant Jewish population, which played a big role in the French Revolution, actually, in the discussion about Jewish emancipation. So where Germany is located is not entirely clear, but there are different centers of Jewish life in Central Europe. And there are different definitions of Germany. There's, this very confusing political definition. Some people refer to it geographically. That's even more confusing, not particularly useful in our context. Culturally, it's a much broader area. And then also social. This is very important in America when Jewish migrants from South Germany and Posen and Bohemia went to America. They defined themselves as German culturally because German culture was very meaningful and important for them. It's very closely connected to Reform Judaism. But they were also, it's a class consciousness, it's a class identity. And other Jews from Eastern Europe were working class. And so Germanist becomes a status symbol. And that would later include Jews from Eastern Europe who defined themselves as German because they were doing better socially. So it's complex. And to make it even more complex, Jews, of course, weren't the only people living in this area. There were many other different people living there. They spoke different dialects and languages. Germans and Poles, often German speakers, I should say, and Polish speakers lived in areas where Jews were living. People could speak the different languages. Non-Jewish Germans could sometimes understand Yiddish. Well, it's not that hard, really. So it's a complicated picture. So historians really prefer to talk about Central Europe. And I put on another map here just to really emphasize the point that maps are really, really problematic. This here is a map that's often reproduced. This one is actually from 1913, from an American atlas. It shows the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It shows different, it does actually here say races. Now that's a very tricky term. It actually shows linguistic groups, and it's pretty suggestive, but it's problematic. Jews, for one, a pretty important group in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, are not even visible on this map. And it really remains up to discussion if these groups are actually even correctly depicted. The question is even if that's even possible. So maps are tricky. They have really limitations. So maps are an important tool of propaganda, nationalist propaganda. So it's important to handle maps very, very carefully. And of course, population density here is not visible, right? That certain areas, there were probably a large part of the population in this area actually is concentrated in a couple cities like Vienna, Budapest, also Prague. And absolute and relative numbers, this is always a tricky thing. And so I just want to really emphasize location of Germany is not so clear. It's better to speak of Central Europe. It's important to distinguish between different meanings of Germany, especially cultural and political, and maps are tricky and problematic. So now really I'm coming to the really more important point, migration in German Jewish history. So it turns out when I speak about historiography, there really isn't much to talk about. It's not a field that is actually very well researched. In contrast to other topics, gender, religion, political history are really well researched. You have listened or you can listen to talks about these topics. That's much more challenging, I think, because there's so much has been written in these fields. There's also quite a bit about social history, but the economic history, which Jonathan Zadlan will talk about in an upcoming talk, and migration are not very well researched. Jonathan Zadlan will talk about the reasons why that is the case for economic history. For migration history, the real reason for that is one, it was really woven into German Jewish history. So it appeared not necessary to focus on this topic because it's so much part of German Jewish history. But I think that also meant certain areas were never looked at. So in a sense, the reason for that is a little bit this image, which I'll talk about later, that Jews were supposedly always migrating and on the move. So there seemed to be no need to really investigate this further. But this also meant that certain aspects were never researched. For instance, Jews from Eastern Europe who went to the United States overwhelmingly crossed Imperial Germany after 1871, and very little was written about this. There are two books I want to mention here that are really important, actually books that influenced me, both by scholars affiliated with the Leo Baeck Institute, Stephen Eschheim, Brothers and Strangers. That is a book about Eastern European Jews in the German Jewish consciousness and also German consciousness. And the book by Jack Wertheimer, Unwelcome Strangers, which is more social history of Jews from Eastern Europe in Germany. These books are really exceptional. There wasn't really much else. And so that's interesting that there's relatively little scholarship. And also the topic here is migration in German Jewish history. It's not emigration or immigration, emigration, and also the area that I'm really interested in, transmigration. They're all part of one process. Migration is an open-ended process. People move somewhere and then they moved somewhere else. Many Jews who moved from Central Europe to the United States in the 19th century, they didn't go straight to New York or Chicago. They often went to New York. They arrived there, but they didn't stay there. They moved to small towns, moved around different small towns, initially as peddlers. They owned small stores, and then eventually they moved to a bigger city like Chicago, Cincinnati, and then sometimes they moved on and finally settled in New York. So it's complex, and immigration, emigration, transmigration are all part of the same process, right? It's just different stages of migration. And so it's important to not isolate that. It's perfectly reasonable to just look at immigration, but I, as a scholar, really try to look at the bigger picture. I think that's really important. And that's more and more the case in more recent works on migration. And I didn't actually mention remigration. That is also part of migration. People sometimes decide for all sorts of reasons to move back where they came from. Sometimes that's part of a strategy. They do not really want to stay very long in this destination. They want to just make some money and then go back home and invest that building a house, for instance. So it's a really broader process that doesn't necessarily have an end. Then really important for this field, the scholarship about modern Jewish history is very much shaped by the so-called nation-state paradigm. So in other words, a lot of studies in the field are really dealing with French Jewish history or German Jewish history or Jewish history in the Netherlands or Anglo-Jewish history, American Jewish history. And for a long time, these fields were kind of separate. There's very little overlap. And in the meantime, since the 1990s, transnational history has really evolved. So looking at processes and migration, not least, beyond borders, and not just at history within the borders of nation states, which only really emerged in the 19th century. And what is really curious is that modern Jewish history and also migration history are very much committed to this nation state paradigm. And the reason is actually quite simple. The big theme in modern Jewish history, so that's the period after 1780, after 1800, the big theme in modern Jewish history is emancipation. So Jews become citizens of Germany, of, well, initially Bavaria, Baden, and so on, and then Imperial Germany, France, Britain. So the state is really important as a reference point. And the same applies to migration. Migration is really crossing borders. So many scholars in migration studies focus on immigration or emigration from a certain place or to a certain place, and not that following people across borders is really hard because it involves research in different archives. Different states have different criteria how they categorize and count people. And so most people simply decide they focus just on one country. But the irony is modern Jewish history and migration studies actually are really, really, they have enormous potential because there's so much going on beyond borders. But still, the focus on the nation-state paradigm partly explains why there is relatively little work on migration and German Jewish history. Then I think that's important in migration studies, how to distinguish different types of migration. So I always try to explain it. It's a spectrum. It's not that there's sort of the ideal voluntary migrant who just decides, you know what, I feel like it. I'm just going to go to America because I can and I'm free to do that, as opposed to somebody who's literally forced to leave their home by somebody with, soldiers and probably lucky to survive. Um, it's really a spectrum. So many people, the free migrant is a little bit of a construct. Many people left for economic reasons, obviously, but they also often wanted to escape constraints, obligations, forced marriages. By moving to America, people liberated themselves from these constraints a little bit. Um, and there are real factors that really, in a sense, don't want to say force, but really put a lot of pressure on people, even though they actually would be counted as free migrants in a sense. In forced migration, that's of course a very tricky, very complicated issue, very closely tied, unfortunately, to German Jewish history, especially after 1933. Um, Even then, I think the question is, and this is the last point, how much agency did people have? Even under a lot of pressure, people sometimes had agency. So obviously somebody who's literally picked up and deported to a death camp and murdered has zero agency. But in the 1930s, even after Kristallnacht, people had, of course, a very limited degree of agency, and they took decisions where to go. And I think that's important. And so it's a much more useful category to look at the agency of people. And then issues like remigration and sort of decisions that seem not to make a lot of sense, all of a sudden appear more sensible. Okay, I promise there will be some images coming. So this is a little bit running through the important migrations in German Jewish history after 1800. So within, through, to, and from Central Europe. So the first really important one is actually an internal migration, even though there's no German nation state until 1871. So this is sort of the area of Central Europe. The big issue here is urbanization, not just for Jews. Everybody's on the move. But Jews move in larger numbers to cities, and not just to cities, they move to very large cities, especially Berlin. So that's really important. And again, this is actually not very well researched. This is really surprising, in my opinion. We have a lot of data, we have materials and archives, so there's still a lot of work to be done. There's to this very day no history of Jews in Berlin, like in one book. And Berlin's history in the 19th century is fascinating. As the Jewish community literally exploded from a very small number, and there were Jews moving in from Silesia, from even South Germany. So that's a fascinating story, and that goes on across Central Europe. So Vienna, um, also Frankfurt, Cologne are cities that attract Jewish migrants from these small towns and villages. At the same time, and one could almost say this is sort of the same process, it's just the journey is a little longer. Uh, Many Jews move from these areas, so from Posen, from the Posen, Western Poland area, it's part of Prussia, Bohemia, and the South German states to the United States. The numbers, there's some argue. I think it's more like 100,000. Some scholars here in the United States think it's more 150,000. We don't really know. We can only estimate. Um, and they also end up in big cities, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cincinnati, really important. But they don't go there directly. I already mentioned many go through small towns. They don't have much money. They're well educated, but they don't have much money. So the men work as peddlers. Then they bring over other family members, and then they establish stores in larger cities. And like German Jews, this is something that Jonathan Zadlin is going to talk about, this fascinating story of Jews in one generation making that transition from the rural poverty to into the Bürgertum, the middle class, in one generation, and that takes place in Germany or Central Europe and in the United States. So that's really an interesting story. Um, then a really important topic that was largely overlooked. It's treated by Eschheim and Wertheimer, but they really focus on Jews who stayed in Germany. Most Jews from Eastern Europe just went through Germany after 1870, about 2 million. This is a very complicated story that I devoted a lot of time in my own research to. It has a lot to do with German steamship lines, railroad lines. Most of these Jewish migrants traveled from Hamburg and Bremen to New York, Canadian ports, a few other ports like Baltimore and Philadelphia. Some also went from Rotterdam and Antwerp, so they had to cross Germany. And it turns out there's actually a lot of material that in archives, and that's something I wrote about in my own work. This continues actually after the First World War. The First World War is also in many ways connected to this migration there. Some Jews were actually recruited or even brought to Germany as forced laborers. This is lesser known. And Germany, Weimar Germany was very liberal, had a very liberal immigration policy, especially Prussia. And so that explains why when the Nazis come to power in 1933, there are over 50,000 Polish Jews living in Germany, and they don't want to go to Poland because the conditions in Poland are also really bad, especially after Pilsudski dies in 1935. So Jewish migration into Germany is a big issue in the Weimar Republic, and it obviously is a big issue for the Nazis. So the Kristallnacht pogrom is obviously connected to the so-called Polen-Aktion, so the forced expulsion of 17,000 Polish Jews across the border in early November 1938. Then, of course, the area that is really well researched, I should have said that earlier, Jewish flight from Nazi persecution between 1933 and 45. And that continues to a certain extent because many Jews decided not to return around the world. I'm going to show a map in a few minutes. Then also relatively well researched now, there's this really good book by Tina Grossman, Jewish DPs in post-World War II Germany. So after the Holocaust, the DP camps, and there's a whole generation of people, Magda and I were just talking about it, born in 1946 in DP camps in Germany, children of survivors, often from Poland, but born in Germany and then moved to the United States and Israel and other places like Canada. Then in the 1960s and 1970s, Jewish migration from the former, at this point, the Soviet Union was still around, and this made a certain impact on West Germany. It's more Austria. Vienna is a very important hub of this transition, of this migration, mostly to Israel. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many Soviet Jews also, or post-Soviet Jews, decided to move to Germany because East Germany had actually formally offered them asylum, and the new German government honored this promise. So this is a really important story that completely changed the outlook of Jewish life in Germany after 1989. And then, of course, another interesting development is Israelis in living in Germany after 1990, especially in Berlin. This is also, I think, an important movement. Yes, okay, let's move on. I just want to show a couple of pictures. I mentioned that I am really interested in transmigration in my book that I just published last year, Between Borders. I used the files of the Hilfsverein. This is the main German Jewish aid organization founded in 1901 and dissolved by the Nazis in the late 1930s. And the annual reports contain photographs that were really taken for to impress donors and to raise money for the Hilfsverein. And there are other similar organizations in other countries. The American Jewish Committee here in the United States, the Anglo-Jewish Association, and of course the oldest of these organizations, the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Paris. They existed to assist Jews in trouble, often in other places. And the German Jewish aid organization focused very much on these trans migrants and coordinated with the Anglo-Jewish Association and also American Jews to ensure that these migrants were protected. Here, this is the main office in central Berlin. This is, they received advice. If they had any, sometimes they weren't quite sure where they were going, or sometimes they lost their money or whatever it was. And this is something that the Hilfsverein dealt with. And here, this is a wonderful picture. This is a dining hall in Königsberg, today Kaliningrad, in East Prussia. And this is also quite interesting. The German Jews made sure that these children, and also the adults, obviously, were given food, and it was kosher. And there were quite a few German Jews who really didn't attach much meaning to that, but they understood that for Jews from the Russian Empire, this was very important to have kosher food, and so they provided that. And of course, again, always keep in mind these pictures were designed to really move the hearts of German Jewish donors to give money to the Hilfsverein to fund these operations. This is from the 1920s. This is a much more tragic chapter. These are layover migrants. So these were migrants who were stuck in Bremerhaven for years, actually, because the United States closed its borders to most Eastern and Southern Europeans and also Asians and Africans. It's a racist and actually implicitly anti-Semitic immigration law in 1924, the National Quota or Quota Origins Act. And this stranded Jewish migrants, and the Hilfsverein cared for these people, and it's a pretty depressing chapter. And in this group here, they were stuck for 8 years in Bremerhaven before they finally were allowed in to the United States. This is the map I mentioned. This is the Philo Atlas, a very important publication for Jews trying to escape Nazi Germany, published under the auspices of the Jewish community in Nazi Germany. And it shows all these destinations. Shanghai is really important, obviously, the United States, and really important Latin America. And this is really a global story. Here's another story. I just want to briefly mention this. This is one of the stories I came about. This is connected to DP camps in Germany. So these were Jews who had escaped to Shanghai, mostly German and Austrian Jews, and they did not want to move to Israel in 1948. So they were in Shanghai. The United States still pursued a very restrictive immigration policy, so they couldn't go to the US. They had to wait for years because of these quotas. And they were in Shanghai, and the communists. There's a civil war in China, and in 1949 the communists took control of Shanghai. They actually didn't harm the refugees, and there were agreements made, but it was clear the refugees had to leave. They didn't want to go to Israel. They also didn't want to go back to Germany, and it was really tricky what to do with these people. And so it was decided to move them to DB camps in what is now West Germany after 1949, against their will. They were taken by ship from Shanghai to San Francisco, put on sealed trains that crossed the United States, and then they were deported here in June to West Germany. Actually, behind the scenes, President Truman was really upset about this. So behind the Congress is refusing to bend, and Truman was able to negotiate a compromise. So they were allowed to return after a few weeks. But the idea was that they couldn't jump the line. They had to go to Germany, apply formally for a visa, and then they were actually fast-tracked, so they come back. And it's a pretty depressing chapter of American immigration history. Okay, so very quickly in the last few minutes, I want to talk about narratives and images. So a very powerful image, I already mentioned this idea that Jewish history is really a history of constant migration, that Jews are always, they can never stay where they move. It's always is persecution, terror, and this is a very problematic image. And it turns out it's actually a Christian stereotype. It's the stereotype of the wandering Jew, or le juif errant in French. This is a Christian stereotype that emerges in the medieval period. Supposedly, Jews had cursed Jesus on the way to the crucifixion, and as sort of a sort of curse, they were cursed to wander and never settle anywhere down. This is and this is a Christian stereotype. It has nothing to do with actual events. And this is a pretty powerful image in the medieval period. And then in the 19th century, unfortunately, a French author wrote a racy novel. I'm going to show you some images. And that popularized this image. And it's also very powerful in an inner Jewish context, not least among Zionists. I'm going to come to that. Also really important is the concept of galut, exile. This is important in Zionism and also in a religious context. What I find really interesting, it's not ancient. It is actually tied to the Talmudic period. So this is not something that Jews at the time of Jesus would have known about. And remember, there are already Jews in exile in Babylon much earlier, and some of these Jews decided to stay there. There's already a Jewish diaspora in the biblical period. But this notion of exile and return to Zion, that has a much more complicated history than many people realize. And it's partly also a product of the period after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 71. I mentioned Stephen Aschheim's book, Brothers and Strangers. So this image of the Ostjude, the Eastern Jew, among German and Western Jews is initially actually an inner Jewish image of traditional Jews who are not assimilating, but it then becomes this notorious stereotype among anti-Semites, and it's closely tied to immigration. So this view that masses of Jews will come across Germany's eastern border, an invasion even, that can be traced back pretty far. So there's a speech that Bismarck gives as a very young representative of the Prussian Landtag in 1847, where he already talks about this the scenario that many Jews will come from the Russian Empire into Prussia, and this is a real threat. So this is a really tricky, problematic term, and Stephen Aschheim's book is really remains unsurpassed in a way in analyzing this image and all the different sort of phases of the image. Even it was even positively charged later in a German Jewish context as sort of the image of the authentic Jew, the real Jew. Um, the Zionists picked up some of these narratives. So obviously the idea of Jews as wandering people facing persecution constantly throughout history and catastrophes, the idea of galut, of permanent exile, that is of course very suggestive and attractive for a Zionist narrative. So they point to the Babylonian exile, to the destruction of the Second Temple, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, 1492, the pogroms in Russia, 1881, and also 1903, the extremely violent, little-known expulsions of hundreds of thousands of Jews by the Russian army during the First World War, and then, of course, 1933, the rise of the Nazis, until 1948, the founding of the State of Israel. So Zionist historiography, Zionist narratives are problematic or tricky. So it's really important to read them critically. However, there were Zionist authors like Arthur Rupin, the famous sociologist, who they were quite aware of these narratives. So there are Zionist scholars who are critical and do very much distinguish between narrative and the data that they're analyzing. And Rupin is somebody who's quite important in that context. Very influential to pogrom thesis. So the idea that Jewish migration is really tied to violence. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but it doesn't apply all the time everywhere. And it turns out my own research has really shown the thesis that Russian Jews fled Russia because of the pogroms after 1881 is actually very much a product of the 1940s. So during the Holocaust, when Jewish historians tried to make sense of Jewish migration, before the people who wrote about Jewish migration during the period before 1933 were mostly social scientists like Rupin and others who were very much focused on data and so not so beholden actually to these narratives. Okay, I promised some images. Here is this novel Les Juifs errants by Eugène Sue, French writer. This is a bestseller. The book is it's more anti-Catholic than anti-Semitic, but it is anti-Semitic. It was really influential and was also translated into other languages. And these images, actually, it's not, this is actual images and illustrations really spread. This is right before TV. People really consumed these images and these illustrations. And Gustave Doré is a very prominent illustrator, and he created countless images of this wandering Jew. And that's really influential. And it's a very problematic image. I love this. I had to add this. This is a cartoon from by Honor Daumier. He's actually mocking the serialization of this novel in the paper Les Constitutionnels. So this was actually a struggling paper, and this novel actually saved the paper. And so it's really funny. The wandering Jews actually, pulling this paper, symbolized by this struggling old guy. So there's some fun humor involved in this also, but it's mostly not a very funny story. And also you see there's this little sack hanging there. That's of course money. So this image was already quite powerful that Jews and money. Of course, this is also a product of the medieval period, and they're, of course, connecting. So the big important question as we come to the end of this, are and were Jewish migrations normal or unique? Of course, it's a tautological circle. Everything is unique, right? Nothing is normal. Uh, so what I found really interesting, looking very closely at people actually writing about migration before the rise of the Nazi regime, so Jewish social scientists and aid workers, also Jewish journalists. So it's mostly an inner Jewish issue. They really pushed against these narratives. They focused on data, I already mentioned that, and they also wanted to show that Jews were really not so different from others, and they really weren't. So general factors affecting all people. Jews weren't the only people in the Russian Empire who were moving. In fact, many of their neighbors, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Poles, German speakers, were also moving. They traveled together, which is documented. Uh, Jews were and are not a homogeneous group. This is something that's very important. Jews in different areas had different reasons to migrate and didn't migrate at the same time. Uh, and as I already said, the data doesn't support these hypotheses of Jewish flight from the pogroms, for instance, before the First World War. Jakob Leszczynski, this is one of these social scientists. He was a journalist from the Russian Empire who lived in Germany and Poland and later in the United States and finally in Israel. So he himself was quite a bit on the move. I found a wonderful text that he published in a German Jewish weekly in 1914, where he interviewed Jewish migrants from the Russian Empire at the border in East Prussia. And he noticed that the people he interviewed, mostly women, they had really subjective reasons why they were leaving. Love and really emotion. It's a very emotional article. It's really a great story. And he realizes that he was a Marxist at this point, that the big structural explanations didn't really apply to these people. And so he says at the end, whoa, there's a real difference here between actual migrants and migrations, which is something that every anthropologist will confirm. So there's a real gap between individuals we study and the big movements of people. So in the scholarship before the Nazi regime, so before the founding of the State of Israel, before the Holocaust, Jewish authors really argued that economic factors explain strong Jewish migration from Eastern Europe. And they really pushed against these stereotypes. And this was overshadowed, of course, the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel. So that gave a real new life to these narratives of, Jewish persecution and Jews on the move all the time. And it is only in recent decades that has really changed. I'm almost done. Very quickly, most people who wrote about this topic originated in the Russian Empire. So this is something you can basically find in my own work. Really interesting, Berlin in the 1920s. There's been quite a bit of work in recent years about Berlin as a transit space for Jewish and non-Jewish scholars, artists, writers from the former Russian Empire. The Jewish Museum in Berlin did a wonderful exhibition about this. So I think that's a big theme that I think is really promising. Uh, I think it's also really important, Jewish flight and displacement before, during, and after the Holocaust. This is really important, and it had an enormous impact on the definition of the United Nations Refugee Charter in 1951. It's really influenced by this. The West German Asylum Clause is influenced by this. Yivo is another interesting story, which is part of the Center for Jewish History. Leszczynski is a co-founder of Yivo, and it was actually based partly in Berlin in the 1920s. I'm not going to talk about this 1932 study, but very briefly, migration and refugee studies has really a lot to do with the Weimar Republic, and it flourishes in the United States like many other fields. So Jewish refugee scholars who spend time in Berlin in the 20s then really become important, influential in the United States after the Second World War and after the Holocaust. So I'm going to skip this to have time for the discussion. And yeah, I'm going to skip this also. I just want to make sure we get some questions. Otherwise, I can talk a little bit about this.
Thank you very much, Tobias. This was a beautiful visually and also very content-rich presentation. I also have to say that personally, it's very close. This topic is very close to my research. I wrote my dissertation on migration as well. I have, of course, like a million questions. I can't ask them all of them here. However, I would like to talk for a minute about those big myths in the historiography, especially in those older approaches. So I can at least like find two or three of them just for now. So I think one of them is, of course, this picture of those impoverished people, Jews living Eastern and also Central Europe, where they are living without penny, and they travel in the Zwischendeck, which is a steerage in English. This is like the third class, very often without the access to the fresh air. And however, we know that, of course, this picture wasn't that easy, that migration required a lot of money, also a lot of knowledge and transnational networks. So I think this is one of the myths. Maybe you would like to elaborate. Also, the other is the myth of no return. So that once people moved to the US and got off the boat, they never came back to the old country. However, of course, in the LBI archives, we have a lot of examples where people write letters and later they also visit the old country. Many of them also, especially men, they go back to look for a bride. They bring her to the US. In this way, also creating the transnational community. And third myth is perhaps this lived perhaps for a little bit longer. This is the myth of not leaving Palestine or Israel once settling down there. Here, of course, the newer publications like Leaving Zion, or also the Unpromising Land of Gur Alroy, they brought up those questions. So yeah, maybe you would like to talk about this a little bit longer, about those myths related to the migration historiography.
Yeah, this is again a common theme that the poor migrated. Um, and they did migrate. And what's interesting, because of technology, so steamships, railroads, poor people could actually afford journeys. And they could only afford these journeys because of networks. So there's somebody on the other end who borrows some money, and and there's money going back and forth, so poor people could actually migrate because they were going to pay it back, right? And there are jobs on the other end, in a sense. So that's how this works. And what is unprecedented in the 19th century, so global migration is not a new phenomenon, but the fact that millions of people move in very short time periods between continents, that's a new phenomenon. And that has a lot to do with, as I said, railroads and steamship lines. But the very poor people could not migrate. So perfect example is the Irish famine. The people who were really affected by the famine, they couldn't move. So the view that the famine explains the Irish mass migration is much too simplistic. It turns out that just like with the pogroms, the people who moved, it's more that they worried about this. So most Jews who moved from the Russian Empire to the United States, they didn't actually come from the area of Ukraine where most of these pogroms took place before the First World War. They came from, broadly speaking, Belarus, Lithuania, northeastern Poland, where the violence against Jews was actually very limited. So, of course, it's economic and networks, but it's more complex. The suffering, this is a very powerful thing in the historiography. There's no shortage of letters of people saying, "Oh my gosh, I got seasick and it was terrible," and so on. Uh, I've been in quite a bit of an argument with an Israeli colleague who thinks that's really true. Gur Alroy, he's written about it. I actually think you have to put this into perspective. So the German-speaking and Irish migrants who came to the United States before the Civil War traveled on sailing vessels. crossing the Atlantic on a sailing vessel was absolutely awful. It took about 2 months. People were thirsty, got seasick, and it was absolutely terrible. Thousands of Irish never arrived. The ships just vanished. People suffered from disease. It's really a pretty awful story. The steamships completely changed that. So was it really nice? No, but it was a pretty quick journey, and there were more and more protections in place. So that really changed, and so I think you have to really put it into perspectives and read some of these complaints critically. Remigration is really important. And there's a lot of evidence for it. I've been in touch with one of the attendees here at this webinar today. So that's quite common for visits, but also some people want to go back, and not all remigrants are people who fail or who, lose their business or whatever. It's often more successful people actually who want to go back and retire in their old ancestral home village. And that also applies to Palestine. I mean, a lot of people, this is actually Gur Royce, he's very correct on this. He sort of really shattered this myth that all people moving to Palestine and later Israel were diehard Zionists who were eager to work on farms and get malaria. No, they were mostly regular people who moved to cities like Haifa, Jerusalem, and Jaffa, and they wanted a better life. They didn't want to work on a kibbutz. But so, yeah.
Yes, so we actually have a lot of questions, and I'll start with one which is a little bit more personal. This is a story of a grandfather who migrated from Lithuania to Germany in 1871 at the age of 20 and became a doctor in Fürth in Germany. And the author of this question asks, what was the likely circumstances in 1871 that could lead the great grandfather, sorry, to come to Germany back then?
Yeah, this is explained in my book. 1868-69 was a terrible, a real starvation crisis in Lithuania. It rained 2 years in a row. The harvest was not brought in. People were starving. Many people, so there's a disease. I think it's cholera. And many Jews really literally fled into, so they're not fleeing violence, they're fleeing this crisis into East Prussia. And there's a strong population growth. So this is a really terrible crisis, and Jews across the German states and also in France are basically coming up with a aid operation to help Jews in Lithuania, which then is part of the Russian Empire. And it turns out already in this early period, many young Lithuanian Jews are on the move. So I did a lot of my work on Chicago. So there's already a Lithuanian Jewish congregation in Marijampolė, which is an important town in the southern part of Lithuania. There's already this Marijampolė congregation in Chicago in 1871. So it makes perfect sense to leave Lithuania. The economic conditions are terrible. And moving to Bavaria at this point, or just Germany in 1871, this is really possible because Bavaria is actually quite friendly, unlike Prussia. And even Prussia is still open in the 1870s. It's only in the 1880s that Prussia shifts to a very rigid anti-immigration policy. And being a Bavaria also meant that this ancestor was not affected by these mass expulsions, because those were only from Prussia in 1885. So that was possible. And it's interesting that on a local level, Jewish communities in Imperial Germany often were very supportive of these migrants because they often did not get citizenship, right? They were foreigners, Russian subjects. And in Prussia, they were affected by these expulsion decrees. And there's a lot of support on the local level to exempt people from the expulsion because they are really important, they provide jobs, they're upright citizens, they're not citizens actually, but they're upright and good people. And this is really fascinating, actually.
We also have a question, why would anybody move or stay after being in the DP camp? Why would they stay in Germany after the World War II and live there?
Yeah, that's actually pretty well researched. Here's also the question why would any Jew in their right minds move back to Germany after the Holocaust? And now, very good question. So I think the DP camps, I think this image of people sitting on packed suitcases, that's sort of this, that I know this from an interview with somebody. So the idea was, well, right now it's, we feel, but there were only a few places that were really safe. And so that's what I know from just talking to people. So I grew up in West Germany, so I obviously know some people who grew up in these DP camps and they decided to stay. Uh, Frankfurt was safe and Munich was safe, in part because there were American troops there. Uh, Moving to a smaller provincial city, I mean, this was awkward. I mean, um, so it's difficult. And again, this image of sitting on packed suitcases. There's also a title of a book like "In the House of the Hangman." It means weird encounters. Yeah, complicated. Why would people move back? Yeah, this is the explanation is that individuals have their own reasons. I was pretty good friends with Werner Tom Engres. Was born in Berlin in 1920. He escaped in the late 1930s, got his PhD at Berkeley. He actually was in the US Army, right? He landed in Normandy, was a parachute trooper, was involved in liberating a concentration camp. And then he taught at Stony Brook for many, many years, first in Berkeley and then in Stony Brook. And he moved back to Berlin after he retired. And yeah, I mean, he taught at the Technical University in Berlin where I studied, and it was for him a personal thing. And he felt really good in Berlin. It was a different Berlin. This is a Berlin in the 1990s, but um, yeah, it's complicated.
I will also add that I think the language was not completely insignificant. So the Yiddish is not that far from German. So of course, learning German once somebody knew Yiddish was much easier than learning a completely different language, and it could
Right.
help with the acculturation in the new country. There are a lot of more questions. One of them I find is very interesting, actually. What are some key methodological challenges historians face when reconstructing migration experiences, especially for ordinary German Jewish families?
Oh, where's this question? Here we go.
Yeah, yeah.
This is a good question. Um, So I already mentioned that, right? In a sense, first of all, uh, it's really important for historians to be very aware of what other people in other disciplines do, especially anthropologists and also psychologists. I think this is crucial. So migration studies is interdisciplinary. It has to be. So somebody who writes about migration and will ignore psychology and anthropology, that's going to be problematic. And uh, as a historian working in this field, I work very closely with sociologists. Sociologists are really good with data. So these are these challenges, right? We are trying to make sense why people do something, even though it doesn't make any sense. So rational choice has its limitations, and that's why anthropology, psychology are important. So my answer would be interdisciplinary approaches are really important.
Yeah, and then we also have this question, which is actually about what will the future historians focus on when writing about German Jewish migration in the 21st century? This is like towards the end.
That's a really good question. So historians are always uneasy talking about the future. So I don't know. Uh, Especially today is another scary day when you look at the news. So who knows what's going to happen, right? I mean, I feel somewhat safer being here than being in Warsaw right now, I have to say. So people might decide, maybe to leave because they don't feel safe anymore in Europe. Who knows? I mean, I can't tell. It's a very unsettled world right now, and there's obviously a lack of leadership here in the United States, false leadership, I don't know. So that is very hard to predict. I mean, the one thing I should say is that German Jewish life has dramatically, or Jewish life in Germany, I should say, has changed dramatically after the end of communism, right? So the Jewish migration from the former Soviet Union into Germany, that is a dramatic change. There were, just in numbers, there were about 27,000 Jews in West Germany, a few hundred in East Germany. And now the numbers range, right, from from 100,000 to 200,000, depending on how one defines who is Jewish and who is not, if the community decides that or others. So that's a dramatic change, but nobody could have predicted that.
Unfortunately, our time is over, but Tobias, thank you very much for this presentation. It was wonderful. And please join us in October for the next lecture on economics. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
I should say one thing very briefly. Anybody can email me with questions. So I may not be able to respond right away, but I will get back to you.
That's great.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much, Tobias. Bye, everybody.
Bye.